All right, how's everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we like to focus on great theories of everything and dig deeply into them and try to suss out the best ways to use these things for our personal edification, our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, and our awakening to a holistic worldview. And we generally cover things that are pretty obscure, that you otherwise wouldn't know about. People who've spent their whole life working on something but never really got recognized, but put in the time and left us with their life's work in some field that usually encompasses all other fields. And today is our 83rd video that we've done on the book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram. And this is a book mainly about meditation technique and practice, and also the maps that you go through as you become more proficient at meditation, the different stages and states of consciousness, so-called. And just kind of gives you a map of the territory, so really you know what you're trying to do and how successful you're being at what you're trying to do. And Ingram has spent a hell of a lot of time over in the Far East at monasteries doing meditation retreats, meditating up to 18, 20 hours a day for many, many days at a time, and also being able to confer with many of the monks and so on that live in these monasteries that are the custodians of a 2,500-year-long tradition of meditative practice and really using meditation as a science technology. And Ingram refers to this just yesterday where he was discussing how, in the West, Americans in particular like to fancy themselves as being the most technologically advanced people. But in terms of meditation, we are about 25 centuries behind many of the Buddhist, monasteries, I would guess. So anyway, we are in a section where Daniel Ingram is kind of talking about his life, his background. This is something that he inserted into the second edition of his book that was not in the first edition, or a much truncated version in the first edition. And he goes into some interesting territory. Right now he's talking about some of the influential events that occurred, which include some dreaming. So he's going to go into some of his dream world here. I think we might be repeating a few sentences here, but we'll get up to the where we left off. In the dream, I was about 3 feet tall, wearing a silver spacesuit with a glass globe helmet, and standing next to me were two similarly dressed, similarly short people, all staring into the distance down the road. We were all holding silver ray guns in our hands. The sun was beating down so brightly that the landscape and colors were washed out in that brightness, with everything hued somewhere between white and yellow with a tinge of light green. Everything was quiet. We were waiting, it seems, for something, but I had no idea what. Far down the road appeared a cloud of gray dust, and suddenly emerging from that dust cloud was a huge black horse, hidden by a huge witch dressed in black. She pulled out a wand and pointed at us, and a blinding bolt of white light flew from the wand, and my entire world exploded into fragments, flying around the room where I had been sleeping. as at this point it makes sense for me to think of myself as awake, just totally blown apart with my body flying around the room in something like sparks, glowing shards, or fireworks. Everything calmed down, the world seemed to reconstitute, and I was lying in my bed hyper alert and buzzing all over. Somewhere around that same time, though again I can't be exactly sure of the sequence as I didn't know the maps, I had my first strong out-of-body experience. I remember lying there in bed, floating up out of my body, looking around the room and down at my body, starting to drift through the wall, then snapping back into my body like I was pulled by a spring. After that, there was a powerful buzzing, like my body was all shaken up, followed by a feeling of paralysis. And after maybe 5 to 10 seconds, I could move again and was awake and had integrated back into my body. This was the first of many such experiences, and I continue occasionally to have out-of-body travels at times, though not as frequently as I did back then. I'm going to add something else in here whose temporal aspects are harder to place. I went on a series of 5-day, 50-plus mile hikes with the Boy Scouts every year from age 10 to 18, starting the day after Christmas and finishing up on New Year's Eve. Well, we would hike between 8 and 21 miles each day with full packs, carrying everything we needed except water, which would be provided at the campsite. That is a long way to hike while carrying a lot of weight, particularly when I was at the younger end of that range, and it was tough. It also gave my mind very little to do except pay close attention to the work involved in every footstep of those hours upon hours of hiking, to the pain in my feet, hips, and shoulders from my boots and the pack, to how to get through it. I remember noticing a few different shifts into different modes of relating to what was going on, places where my steps got sort of jerky, which I'm sure now, upon reflection, were cause and effect, which is the second insight stage. Places where my shoulders got asymmetrically tense and my posture got strangely skewed to one side, which I am sure now was 3 characteristics, the third insight stage. And places where I am certain now that I was in some very altered states that I can't really classify well from this distant vantage point. This makes me wonder how many soldiers have crossed into insight territory while on long marches, and how much of PTSD-related disability and suicides are in some ways related to dark night territory, arising, which is stages 5 through 10, insight stages, arising along with the horrible circumstances of war. Exactly what experiences occurred during those hikes is unclear, as the long trails through the forests of North Carolina don't give me enough reference points to determine that. Still, I think those hikes served as a sort of walking meditation and endurance training that helped with my practice later. What happened after I crossed the arising and passing away event, which is stage 4? The first time is hard to sort out. I was an adolescent in junior high and a total geek. My family had some structural issues and dysfunction that impacted my basic happiness. Those were hard times. I can't, from this vantage point, sort out exactly what was just hormones and the awkwardness of that phase of life. What were the stressors of that set of transitions from childhood to adulthood? What related to the challenges of junior high school and the fact that kids are cruel at times? What related to what was going on in my family at that time and what might have been the effects of crossing the arising and passing away? I knew I felt different, but that was not particularly new. I was generally pretty angry, but that wasn't particularly new either. I felt somehow outside of what was going on. Like what was going on was a distraction from something much more real. But what that much more real was, I had no idea. Paradoxically, I also felt totally trapped in a life that felt like it was profoundly wrong in most ways. Like it had some deep fundamental flaw at its core. And I was trying to avoid drowning in it. I can remember many nights after that first arising and passing event, lying there in my bed, drawing on every ounce of my strength, my little adolescent being possessed, to try to keep it together and get through the night, as free-floating feelings of horror and misery coursed through me out of proportion to the circumstances that, while bad, still didn't warrant that degree of emotional agony. Later passes through the arising and passing, and their tendency to reignite these challenging feelings would begin to reveal the pattern of dark night, following amazing insights that I would come to know so very well. I wonder if I didn't cross the arising and passing away somewhere earlier in my life, but I can't remember it. I say this because of the following odd bit of data between the ages of about 11 and 17. Whenever I signed my name, particularly on school papers, I would add the following symbol beneath my name. And this symbol seems like it looks very much like a sideways tree of life, Kabbalah tree of life, but it's missing a couple of, it's missing all the sephiro, or all the spheres, but it has the lines. And you can kind of see an A and an X in there where you're looking at it straight on, and an N. But it's, you know, I guess would be probably, he would think of it as some kind of a sigil, but we'll see what he says here. This symbol contains the letters for Nivazo. Okay, I can not really see that, but I can see some of those letters. Squished together, the O I don't see at all, but Nivazo, N-I-V-A-Z-O, squished together and stylized into a sigil. On the rare occasions when someone asked me about what it meant, I would reply, Buddhist heaven is called nirvana. It is a place of bliss, peace, and connection. Nivazo is my word for Buddhist hell, a place of chaos and total disconnection. I had no idea what the real Buddhist term was, that the real Buddhist term was samsara. So not knowing that, I apparently felt I needed to give my experience, which involved an acute sense of chaos and disconnection, a name, and so Nivazo it was. From my current perspective, I consider that very unusual bit of precocious insight to be suggestive of some sort of dark night process. Anyway, it is interesting how, in retrospect, we try to make sense of our early lives, to fit the mysterious actions of a child into the simple boxes that an adult can understand. That's the end of that chapter. And the next chapter is called Body Surfing. I've spent hundreds of hours body surfing at the beach between my childhood and adult life. I was body surfing this morning before I wrote this section. I started when I was probably 10 years old and spent many hours doing this every day when my family would go on beach vacations, which I have gone on at least once per year since then. Body surfing taught me a lot about waves. To catch a wave and have its power send you shooting out across the flat water in front of you for a long distance, you must time your jump into the wave exactly right. The wave itself must be just right, must be curling just right, and you must catch it at just the right time. The water the wave is breaking into also must be just right, smooth, not too shallow, and at least stationary or more optimally pulling back out to sea, as that maximizes the speed difference between you and that underlying water, which helps you keep your head up so you can see where you're going, enjoy the speed, and steer properly. If your timing is not perfect or the wave is not just right, either you won't get caught by the wave, or when the wave catches you, something bad will happen, like getting forcibly tumbled into the sand below the water. If you catch the wave just perfectly and the water below you is perfect, you can go shooting towards the beach for a long run, head held up with great control of your direction of travel. It is a thrilling feeling. I body surf with one hand out in front to steer and one hand below me to give lift to my head so that I can see where I'm going. And I prefer that greatly to the style where you are head down in the water. Head up body surfing makes for much longer, faster, and more enjoyable rides. To fill all the conditions simultaneously, to catch the perfect wave at just the right time with just the right underlying water requires modifying your brain and attention such that you become a wave-reading creature rather than one concerned with anything else, as you quickly learn the potentially painful consequences of getting it wrong. While some of this eventually becomes intuitive, it requires great immersion in the moment. Your feet and legs feel when the water just above the sand is pulling back toward the sea. Your torso and arms can feel the right moment to jump into the wave on the surface. Your eyes become attuned to the exact curl of the waves coming toward you and the depth of the water you might be hurtling over. You can see exactly the angle of the breaking wave and whether there are other waves that might interfere with that wave, either by coming into it sideways or running over it. Your ears hear waves behind you as you finish your run, such that you can avoid being slammed down into the sand when you try to stand up. You also must watch for those around you such that you don't crash into them. That is a lot to pay attention to, a rich and engaging world of forces, movements, tensions, fluxing, and flowing to get lost in. When you get it just right, feeling the perfect convergence of forces and fluxing, you are richly rewarded as the power of the wave catches you and you shoot towards the beach. That word convergence is important, as this style of body surfing requires everything to be just right for it to work properly. When you get it wrong, sometimes you just miss the wave, and sometimes the wave puts you through the spin cycle and possibly drives you to the bottom. The larger the waves, the greater the reward, but also the greater the punishment when you have improperly gauged all of the factors, and the potential to get badly hurt or die is very real. I have body surfed on waves whose curl was up to about 8 feet high above the surface of the underlying water, but wouldn't recommend that until you know what you're doing, and perhaps not even then. Often your positioning isn't quite right, or the wave isn't quite right, or the other conditions aren't quite right, and you must either dive under or jump over that wave, which is itself another skill in wave reading and negotiation. I think that the many hours I've spent body surfing were invaluable for my Vipassana practice, as once I got the hang of Vipassana, I found that it was often just about feeling those same sorts of waves, convergences, and flows, but this time for objects like attention itself and the notion of energy in the body, even space fluxes, and we can learn to ride those fluxes into perfectly converging moments of clarity, just like we can learn to ride waves in the ocean. when everything converges just so, that can cause important shifts in our perspective, that being the various states of concentration and stages of insight. While I wouldn't necessarily recommend body surfing as it can be dangerous, I think that it honed underlying skill sets that translated well into meditation. If you decide to try this style of body surfing, please take responsibility for your own actions and safety, doing it with people around, on waves of reasonable size, on a soft, sandy beach without rocks or other hazards. And that's the end of that chapter. Chapter 45 is called College and Pre-Buddhist Exploration. The next time I remember crossing the Rising and Passing was the summer after my junior year in college at UNC Chapel Hill. I wonder what year that was that he was there. What years? I had been philosophizing heavily and hanging out extensively with my housemate Kenneth Folk. He had also crossed the Rising and Passing a few times by that point back in California using totally different methods, and at the time he also didn't know what it was. We lived together with my friend Chris in a grungy band house covered in acid art from the previous tenants. Kenneth and I often philosophized furiously while playing frisbee in empty parking lots late at night. We spent countless hours searching, reading, discussing, and debating things related to what we felt were the deep questions, particularly topics such as free will versus superdeterminism, unitive models presented by physics, and the tensions with dualistic human experience. This is not something depressed people tend to do, more like something obsessed people do. And we were obsessed with trying to figure the thing out, though we weren't even sure what the thing was. Our hunt was somewhat eclectic, including the poetry of T.S. Eliot, the writings of Tolstoy, and authors such as Ken Wilber. During that time, Kenneth and I forged a deep friendship. One of the key topics we had been discussing was the observer or watcher and how this related to the question of non-duality. Kenneth took off after that school year, going back to California to start the more formal meditative phase of his spiritual quest, and I was still living in this grungy acid art band house. I had no classes for the summer. I was just working about 2 or 3 nights a week running sound for bands, which was my living all through college and for 2 years thereafter. So I had a lot of time to do basically nothing. One day I was just sitting on the couch when I decided to take on the watcher directly. I'm not sure exactly what inspired this practice, as Buddhism in a formal practice sense hadn't shown up in my life yet. But trying to make sense of my experience just seemed to be the right thing to do at the time. I began trying to catch the watcher, second after second, really going after the visceral, perceptual experience of what was observing. And before I knew it, got into this rapid fire back and forth, super concentrated state of everything vibrating in my head, and the whole vibration zapped back through my skull at a very high speed into a black space, and it was done. The whole process from start of contemplation to finish couldn't have lasted but a minute or two, and the quick zap lasted less than a second. There were no other fireworks, no bright lights, no amazing dreams, no bliss, nothing. Just that. But that was all it took. I broke up with my girlfriend of the time for no particularly good reason and moved into an apartment alone and was relatively dark for a while. Interestingly, that particular girlfriend would later become my first wife, and That means that she was already experiencing some of the unfortunate side effects of being in a relationship with a practitioner, except that I wasn't a practitioner that I knew of, except that I unknowingly was. I mention her because she is quite important to the story, except that I'm not going to say a lot about her. Despite her very social persona, she was a relatively private person in many ways, and I respect that privacy. Our stories are extremely connected. She was on retreat with me for most of my early retreats, and with me during my travels and travails for the first 6 years of my Dharma practice. The take-home from it all is that early Dharma practice and relationships can be a rocky road, particularly when both people are dealing with various stages of insight, though just one going through it can be more than enough to cause trouble. I owe her a lot, as she was very supportive through most of it, and I wish her all the best. While she was there for many formative parts of my journey, most of the story hangs together pretty well without going into details about her, and the Dharma lessons are the same. I transmit many of the lessons I learned from my interactions with her and the Dharma in various places in this book in generic ways, so hopefully the practical message gets through without having to go into specifics. My gratitude extends to her for everything she did to support my practice and teach me about life. The third time I crossed the arising and passing occurred during the year after graduation from college. I was dancing in a club while running sound for a great dance band called Mr. Potato Head. And I began spinning around and got into a very altered state, dancing wildly with tremendous energy, feeling an intense and cathartic long-sought freedom like something I had forgotten, and an amazing bliss and sense of power welled up through my being, overtaking the dancing and dancing me effortlessly with this cone of raw power, in the center around which the world and my body were spinning and moving quite on their own. Wiccans and whirling dervishes take note here. And then it peaked in joy and intensity and was done. After that, I began to have to meditate to feel normal. I would go outside before work, lie on the ground, breathe very slowly, and somehow that would help a little. Shortly thereafter, I got frustrated and angry at the band I was running sound for, quit working for them, got a job as a cook in a gourmet seafood restaurant called Squid's, and then moved to California for a while. And that's the end of the chapter. The next chapter is called The Middle Years. I don't recall when I next crossed the arising and passing, but I know the effect it had. I suddenly needed to go on retreats, so I did. I had done no formal meditation practice since 4th grade, knew little of Buddhism, but on the advice of Kenneth Folk, I went on a 9-day intensive insight meditation retreat at IMS with Christopher Titmus, Sharda Rogel, and Jose Reisig in August of 1994. So that's interesting. I moved to Chapel Hill in October of 1993. So I might have seen him at one of these. Chapel Hill had a very burgeoning music scene at that time, and so I can definitely see him running sound for some band, although I've never heard of Mr. Potato Head before. But I wonder if I ever saw him at some venue checking out music. He was definitely friends with a couple of my friends from later on. Backing up just slightly, some explanation is required here. I went on that retreat not only because the arising and passing was continuing to drive my desire to find spiritual answers, some resolution to the tension and questions that it created and half answered, but also because long meditation retreats had visibly benefited Kenneth, who by this point had done the 3-month retreat at the inside at IMS, and then a few months later went to spend 6 months on retreat at the Malaysian Buddhist meditation center, and then immediately 6 months more in Burma for a total a year-long retreat in Asia. We had been on the road together in a band and lived together for most of a year. Those sorts of close experiences show the various sides of everyone involved. It was quite apparent that his meditation practice had done something very good for him, though exactly what it was I couldn't put my finger on, as this was before the phase in which Kenneth and I got into talking much about the details of practice and results. So I went on that first retreat. Okay, we're going to stop right there and take over where we left off tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a